All right, diving in today, folks, we're tackling something, well, it seems simple on the surface.
Hmm.
Altruism, right? You hear the word, you kind of get the gist. But anyone who's dipped their toes into philosophy knows there's a whole lot more swirling beneath.
Oh, absolutely.
And we've got a real treasure trove of philosophical deep dives to guide us today, primarily the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on altruism. So think of this, as us taking a scalpel to this concept, laying it all out, but specifically for the philosophical mind, right? Yours, dear listener.
Yes, exactly. A real focused inquiry into what it even means to act for others. We'll dissect the concept itself, poke around whether it truly exists, and get into the why, the big why that's fascinated philosophers for ages. Why would we or should we even go out of our way for people beyond ourselves?
So, getting down to the nitty-gritty, Stanford Encyclopedia kicks things off with a nice, clean definition. Altruism. Behavior driven by wanting to benefit someone else, but entirely for their sake. And this, right away, boom, separates it from self-interest, where it's all about your gain, and obviously miles away from malice, where someone's out to cause harm.
And what's intriguing, even for, a seasoned philosopher listening in, is how we use altruism more broadly, even talking about animals.
Yeah.
Like picture a mother bear protecting her cubs. No question she's benefiting them, often at a huge risk to herself. But Stanford Encyclopedia is careful to point out, saying she's doing it for the sake of her cubs, like we discussed with human intention. That's a whole other jump, right?
Yeah, there's layers to this. So for us today, we're locked in on that deliberate human altruism, actions taken consciously with the goal of helping someone because we want to. And this just throws us into all these great philosophical head scratches, right? Like, where's the line for how altruistic we should be? Is it always a good thing, morally speaking? And what are the reasons we choose to act for others?
Indeed, and then it's the big one. Is pure altruism even real? Or, like some folks argue, are seemingly selfless acts just self-interest disguised?
The age-old debate. Okay, so to get through this philosophical jungle, we've got to be clear about what we mean, right? We'll pick apart the types of altruism, pure motives versus mixed ones, strong versus weak versions. Then we got to tackle that skepticism from psychological egoism, where folks say true altruism is just a myth. Then, for fun, a quick glance at those wilder metaphysical ideas, the ones questioning if there even is a self and other. And finally, the main course. All those different philosophical takes on why we'd bother caring about others, from ancient ideas about living a good life to modern takes on impartial reason, and even the role our feelings play. A lot to chew on for the philosophical mind.
Indeed, a real feast for thought.
So let's carefully define our terms. The encyclopedia smartly points out, altruism covers not just doing good for someone, but also stopping harm. That driver being super cautious on a street with kids playing. They're not directly boosting the kids' well-being, but they're intentionally avoiding causing harm. And that caution, stemming from concern, that counts as altruism.
A crucial point, and this leads us right into mixed motives. Our careful driver, right? They might also be very aware of what happens if they hit a kid, legally speaking. So their cautious driving, it could be genuine concern for the kids and a desire to avoid trouble. One action in the real world fueled by both altruistic and self-interested motives, even though those motives themselves, they're distinct.
Exactly. A motive, it's either for the benefit of another or for yourself. But what we see someone do, that can be a mix. Now, on to pure altruism. That's action with absolutely no self-serving motives, right? The example of the unused theater ticket, that's perfect. Let's say you're sick, can't make the show. You call the box office solely so someone else can use the ticket. No gain for you, no loss really either. Pure altruism, different from self-sacrifice.
Precisely. Self-sacrifice, by definition, means some cost to the person doing the good deed. This brings us to strong and weak altruism. Strong altruism, that's acting even when you think it'll hurt your own well-being. Weak altruism, on the other hand, is at least partly motivated by wanting to help or avoid hurting someone else. Think of someone always putting themselves first, but their actions happen to benefit others too. Maybe weakly altruistic, but wouldn't we say they're not truly altruistic deep down? So the real test, the strong kind, is someone willing to be worse off for the sake of someone else. That's what really challenges the idea that we're always selfish, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's really prioritizing someone else's good above your own. The encyclopedia also makes this distinction between moral motives and altruistic ones. Keeping a promise, that's moral, driven by obligation, duty. Not necessarily by specifically wanting to make the other person better off, but giving a gift because you genuinely want to bring the recipient joy, that's altruistic, focused on their good.
Exactly. Altruism at its core is about the well-being of others. It's tied in with ideas like charity, benevolence, kindness. And while we often direct those impulses toward people we have bonds with, family, friends, people we owe something to, can also be sparked just by seeing a stranger in real need.
And this is key for being philosophically clear. Just because someone's motivated by wanting to help doesn't mean their action is automatically good or praiseworthy. Someone could genuinely want to help, but be completely wrong about what is helpful. The intentions there may be even admirable, but the result could be the opposite of good.
Precisely. Virtuous motivation, potentially, but the act itself could be judged as misguided or even harmful. Now let's dive into well-being. It underpins so much of this.
Yeah.
The encyclopedia is spot on. We got to separate what makes up well-being, those things essential for a flourishing life, from the tools, the means we use to get there. Think like health, that's part of well-being. Exercise, that's a way to achieve it.
Right, like all those different theories about well-being out there, they're essentially arguing over what those essential ingredients are. What does living well truly mean? And Stanford Encyclopedia reminds us well-being isn't some on-off switch, right? It's on a spectrum. We experience it in degrees.
Exactly. And when we talk about benefits, advantages, all in the context of well-being, we mean things inherently good for someone, those things composing their well-being, not just stuff useful for getting other goods. The article then gets into this subtle but important difference. Perfectionist value, being excellent at something, versus prudential value, what actually adds to someone's well-being. Like being an amazing pianist, that's perfectionist value. But if that also brings the pianist joy, fulfillment, then it's adding to their prudential value too.
So mastering a skill is one thing, but if it truly enriches your life, makes you better off overall, that's where it gets prudential. And here's where altruism links up. When we act altruistically, we're aiming for that prudential value in others, not just stopping their suffering. It could be helping their talents grow, like starting a scholarship for musicians, or helping them appreciate things that are just good in themselves, like maybe that study of philosophy, right?
Precisely. Someone obsessed with, say, understanding Kant perfectly, but not caring if anyone else gets it or benefits. Not really altruistic. They're fixated on that perfectionist value for themselves. And the encyclopedia emphasizes altruistic motivation. It's about the helper's perspective on the helped person's well-being. It's not necessarily about what the helped person thinks about it. A kid lost in a game might not see developmental benefits, but the adult encouraging them, concerned for their well-being, that's altruistic.
A really important point. And the example of the philosophy lover, maybe they don't see their intellectual pursuits as directly benefiting them, but their friends supporting those endeavors because they believe it does enrich their life. That shows how the altruism lies in the helper's view, their attitude toward the other person's good. All right, so we've waded through all these definitions of altruism, and now we hit this big philosophical roadblock. Does true altruism even exist? This is where psychological egoism throws down the gauntlet.
Indeed. Psychological egoism, the claim that every single human action, no matter how selfless it looks, is ultimately motivated by self-interest. Helping others. Just a tool to get something for yourself, they say, even if it's subtle or unconscious. Genuine concern for others, gone.
And in the encyclopedia breaks this down nicely. Psychological egoism comes in different strengths. The most hardcore version. We're never motivated to benefit others for their sake, period. Weaker versions say, okay, maybe altruistic motives exist, but self-interest always plays a part too, so no pure altruism. And yet another weaker version argues we never willingly sacrifice our own well-being for someone else.
So let's look at the arguments for psychological egoism. There's the empirical argument, trying to prove it through observation, evidence. But as our source points out, relying on anecdotes like, oh, all the people I know are selfish, that's shaky ground. And even the experimental stuff from psychology, like Bathen's work on empathy, that's still being debated.
So proving everyone's selfish just by watching how they act, that seems pretty tough. Then there's the a priori argument, the philosophical reasoning from first principles, This one often takes cues from Plato, built on two main ideas. First, all motivation involves desire. Second, all desires are basically like hunger. For those listening with philosophical ears, a priori means it's about logic and concepts, not going out and observing things in the world.
Right. And the hunger analogy, that's key here. When we're hungry, we want food, but not for the food itself. We want that feeling of satisfaction from eating it. The psychological egoist says it's the same even when we seem to act for others, like giving a gift to make someone happy. We're just hungry for that good feeling we get from their happiness. Their pleasure is the food, satisfying our self-interested appetite.
I see the logic, but it feels a little too neat, maybe even cynical. And the encyclopedia throws some good punches back. Think about the desire for your kids to do well long after you're gone. Where's the personal satisfaction in that? It's purely about their well-being. Plus, if you sacrifice now to ensure their future prosperity, that contradicts the claim that we never give up our own well-being for others.
Exactly. That idea that all desires are like hunger just doesn't capture all the ways humans are motivated. We aim for things beyond our own subjective pleasure. And that first premise, too, that all motivation is desire, that's tricky. If we define desire so broadly that it means anything that gets us to act, well, then the claim's just saying what motivates us is what motivates us. Not very insightful, is it?
Plus, in real life, we say stuff like, ugh, I don't want to do this, but I should. Obligation, duty, that seems to make us act without us craving any satisfaction from it. The encyclopedia points out simply recognizing someone needs something, that can be enough to make us help without us first feeling like we want to. It's acknowledging the need and then feeling like we ought to do something about it.
Right. Saying I wanted to help him. In those cases, it can be misleading. Like it implies we were hoping to gain something or feel good before even helping. Sure, we might feel good after, but that doesn't mean chasing that feeling was the original goal. So that hardcore a priori argument for psychological egoism, the one saying it's always about personal satisfaction, that falls apart.
Okay, so what about those weaker versions of psychological egoism? The ones that say self-interest is always at least partly there and that we never willingly sacrifice our well-being for others.
The encyclopedia admits it's hard to completely disprove the idea that self-interest is always lurking somewhere in our actions. Human psychology is complex. We can have unconscious motives. So saying for sure that altruism is never mixed with self-interest, that's philosophically tricky.
But that claim about never sacrificing our well-being for others, that seems easier to counter. We just mentioned sacrificing for your kids, no logical reason why it can't happen. And watching people, it clearly does. People make sacrifices, big and small, for loved ones, for causes they believe in, even for strangers in trouble.
Exactly. This idea that humans are always so self-centered, it just doesn't ring true. It makes more sense to think of a whole spectrum of motivations, some leaning toward egoism, some toward altruism, many in between, capable of self-sacrifice to varying degrees. It's better to judge individuals on their actions in specific situations, rather than slapping this universal everyone's selfish label on everything.
This leads to a great counter-question. Does pure egoism even exist? The encyclopedia throws this out there. Maybe every time we act on what we think is our own best interest, there's actually some care for others mixed in. We often consider how what we do affects those around us, even when we're focused on ourselves. It's surprisingly hard to find examples of pure, unadulterated self-interest, completely ignoring everyone else.
It forces us to think about how interconnected we are, how inherently social humans are. Our source even throws out this wild hypothetical, what if all motivation is actually other-regarding? Even seemingly selfish actions, ultimately done for someone else. The point is, those extreme claims, no altruism exists or no pure egoism exists, those seem shaky compared to the more common-sense idea that we've got mixed motivations all the time.
So, the extreme versions of psychological egoism don't hold up under scrutiny. We're probably working with a mix of motives, and genuine altruism, at least in some form, seems possible. Now, the encyclopedia takes a quick detour into some pretty radical metaphysical territory. They question the whole self versus other distinction. That's pretty far out from how we normally think.
It is. These views challenge the very idea that justifying caring for others is somehow harder than justifying caring for ourselves. Why should that be? One challenge comes from how our identity changes over time. That younger you is saving for retirement. In a way, they're providing for a future self will be different, have different needs. Isn't that kind of like altruism towards a future other? That's an idea explored by Derek Parfit.
Blurs the lines, right. And then there's Hume, that whole introspection thing. He said, when we look inward, we don't find this solid, unchanging self. It's more like a constant flow of thoughts, perceptions, makes you think maybe the self and other split isn't as clear-cut as we assume.
And another view sees humans as inherently social, part of these bigger social structures. From that angle, self-interested and altruistic don't matter as much as the idea of contributing to the well-being of the whole community. Thinkers like David Brink and Thomas Herka have argued along these lines, especially talking about common good.
Some really big shifts in perspective there, making us rethink basic assumptions. But like the encyclopedia says, for the rest of this discussion, we're going to stick mostly with that more familiar framework. Separate individuals, each with their own well-being, self-interested motives, and altruistic ones, distinct but often mixed up together. Which brings us back to the core ethical questions. Why be altruistic? Does it need to be justified? And is egoism somehow the default position, needing less justification?
Precisely. Moral philosophy gives us a whole buffet of answers. The source lays out three main schools of thought. Eudaimonism, the idea that being altruistic actually helps you flourish. The impartial reason approach, all about impersonal moral thinking. And sentimentalism, where sympathy and compassion are the driving forces. Stanford Encyclopedia also gives a nod to the Christian view of love, which blends self-fulfillment with this Neoplatonic idea of imitating a loving God.
Let's start with eudaimonism. This one's got deep roots, back to ancient Greece and Rome with big names like Aristotle. It says our ultimate goal is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, well-being, or flourishing. And the big claim is that acting altruistically is a key part of achieving that for ourselves.
That's the core idea. Ancient ethics, generally speaking, it assumed that figuring out your own good was the main point of ethics. But the encyclopedia warns us not to oversimplify it. It's not about being selfish in a crude way. Aristotle, for example, he's all about loving your friends for their sake, and he explicitly says it's wrong to treat people like tools to get what you want. That's a big part of his framework for friendship.
So not using people, but seeing certain virtues like justice, generosity virtues that involve how we treat others as actually part of our own well-being, not just ways to get it. By being good to others, we're helping ourselves flourish. So how exactly did the ancients like Aristotle argue that being just or generous actually helped them achieve eudaimonia?
Aristotle thought that living virtuously, including being just and generous, cultivates this well-ordered soul, which he saw as crucial for eudaimonia. Engaging in virtuous actions allows us to use our reason in line with excellence, leading to a sense of fulfillment and a life truly well lived. He also saw strong social bonds and a flourishing community as key for eudaimonia, things that are nurtured by virtuous behavior.
So the motivation for a specific altruistic act might not be completely selfless in the sense of expecting absolutely zero personal gain. But the eudaimonists would say consistently acting in ways that benefit others, that's part and parcel of flourishing overall. The critique, of course, is that eudaimonism, by grounding altruism in self-interest, might miss the mark on that strong altruism, where you sacrifice for others even when it seems to hurt your own well-being.
That's a valid point, and the encyclopedia acknowledges it. Aristotle doesn't explicitly talk about situations where treating others well might actually make you worse off, but the heart of eudaimonism remains. There's an inherent benefit to cultivating altruistic motives, and ethical virtue itself is a crucial piece of a good life. It's not about saying we shouldn't care about others directly, but understanding how that care fits into a bigger picture of personal flourishing.
Now, jumping ahead to the modern era, we get to impartial reason. This is a big shift from eudaimonism's focus on the self. It emphasizes this impersonal, objective view, like seeing things from a God's eye perspective. The idea is to get past our individual biases and figure out what's right from a universal standpoint. We're really switching gears now to a very different way of thinking about morality, trying to remove our individual biases from the equation. Let's delve a bit deeper into how thinkers like Kant and the utilitarians tackled this impartial perspective.
Indeed. While we can find hints of this impartial view in ancient thought, like the common good in Plato and Aristotle, or the Stoic idea of universal cosmic order, there's a tension there with eudaimonism. Modern ethics, particularly the impartial reason crowd, they tend to put this impersonal perspective front and center, rather than trying to link altruism back to self-interest.
And there are different ways to make this impartiality concrete. Utilitarianism, for example, it's all about maximizing overall well-being, giving equal weight to everyone's happiness, including your own. So your own happiness doesn't get special treatment just because it's yours.
Exactly. And impartiality can also mean applying the same set of rules to everyone. No exceptions for yourself or your buddies. The classic lifeguard dilemma shows this. Impartiality as a universal rule doesn't tell the lifeguard whether to save their friend or a bunch of strangers, but it does say whatever principle guides their decision, it should apply to any lifeguard in the same situation.
Key difference there. A consequentialist view, like utilitarianism, would probably say the lifeguard's got to save the bigger group, maximize the good, personal ties be damned. But that weaker kind of impartiality, focused on universal rules, might say it's okay to prioritize a friend sometimes, as long as that principle could be a general rule.
The encyclopedia points out, consequentialists can sometimes justify looking out for number one on practical grounds. We usually know our own needs better, can meet them more efficiently. But the big picture goal remains. Impartial concern for everyone, which often leads to a lot of altruistic action, helping others, However, a common criticism of consequentialism is that it might not recognize the special duties we have to ourselves and the importance of having different roles in society.
Well, that weaker impartiality, the universal rules kind, that can handle those concerns better. The duty to help strangers, it usually has an unspoken out. It shouldn't wreck your own life, so it balances self-interest with the needs of others. So, for these impartial reason folks, the why be altruistic answer is either to maximize well-being impartially or to follow universal moral duties. Both reject that strong eudaimonistic idea that your own flourishing is the only ultimate goal.
Then we have Thomas Nagel. His work's really important, especially his arguments in The Possibility of Altruism. He takes on both psychological egoism and ethical egoism, the view that we have no direct moral obligations to others by using this concept of the impersonal standpoint. He says, as rational beings, we can see ourselves as just one individual among many in the world, not giving ourselves special treatment.
He's got this compelling analogy to prudence. He suggests, just like we rationally think all points in our own life are important to our well-being, we should see others' well-being as equally important in our moral thinking. The fact that I'm me doesn't give my well-being priority any more than the fact that someone else is not me gives us a reason to disregard theirs. Ignoring someone's well-being just because they're not you, that's as arbitrary and irrational as ignoring your future well-being just because it's in the future. He talks about these objective reasons, which he called agent neutral, later on a term that Parfit also used. These are genuine reasons for acting that apply to everyone, regardless of who they are. For example, my pain gives everyone a reason to want to relieve it. Imagine seeing someone suffering. An agent-neutral reason to help isn't just, oh, I'd feel bad if I didn't. It's that pain itself is bad no matter who's experiencing it. It's a universal reason to want to ease suffering.
This view, it has common ground with utilitarianism, both emphasizing a selfless perspective. Each person's just one moral subject among many, all equally important. Nagel says our normal self-centered view makes us insular, closed off, and the impersonal standpoint tries to fix that. But as the encyclopedia points out, Nagel runs into a problem. If everyone's pain and suffering gives everyone else a reason to act, why aren't we constantly overwhelmed by everyone else's needs? All those reasons from other people would pile up immensely.
And the encyclopedia says, trying to solve that by saying, well, the reasons of people further away matter less. That seems made up just to fit the theory and kind of looks like egoism again. So are we stuck choosing between ethical egoism and Nagel's maybe overly demanding impartiality?
Now we come to sentimentalism, which criticizes all the previous views for leaving out emotions. They say morality isn't just about thinking, reason, principles. It's also about the heart, our feelings.
Right. They argue that eudaimonism's reason for caring about others is ultimately selfish. Consequentialism can ignore personal bonds when it's busy maximizing good. And even weak impartiality relies on abstract rules, maybe missing that emotional connection that's so important to being moral. Sentimentalists say our emotions about the well-being of others, they can be fitting and appropriate in themselves, like feeling grief when someone dies. It doesn't matter if those emotions make us do anything. Altruistic feelings like compassion, sympathy, they're the right response to certain situations. Helping is just the natural way those feelings show up. Being indifferent, not acting when someone's suffering, those are moral failures because we're missing the proper emotional response.
Immanuel Kant, our source discusses him, he had a different take on sympathy. In his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant said, people who enjoy spreading joy, they're good, but their actions don't have true moral worth if they're just doing it because it feels good. Mm-hmm. For him, it's about acting from duty to a moral law that makes sense rationally. He's got this famous thought experiment. A compassionate person loses their ability to feel, but keeps helping others out of duty. Kant says that action, done purely from duty, has the highest moral worth.
The encyclopedia critiques Kant's view. It agrees, helping others only because it benefits you, like comforting a crying kid just so you can have some peace, that's not very admirable. But they bring up Robert Nozick's experience machine thought experiment. It argues that real compassion means wanting to actually benefit someone, not just have the feeling of helping. Someone truly compassionate would probably choose real joy for someone else, even if it's less intense, over just a simulated experience of their happiness.
And while we might agree with Kant that sometimes we have to act from duty even when we don't feel like it, the encyclopedia suggests that lots of times acting out of genuine care is morally good, even if it's not strictly duty. Imagine a novelist reading to someone who's blind, just because they love literature and want to share it. No sense of obligation. Seems strange to say that doesn't deserve praise or moral worth just because it comes from their own enjoyment.
The discussion of Kant ends by saying, even if you can't blame someone for losing their ability to feel compassion, maybe because of some misfortune, there's still something morally wrong there. The relationships are damaged, they're not responding emotionally how they should. Being cold, doing your duties without joy, that can undermine those very human connections that morality is often about.
So, sentimentalism, circling back, it says our feelings can be right or wrong, fitting or not, regardless of whether they make us do anything. Caring about your kids, even when you can't help them, that's still an appropriate emotion. But helping someone in a cold, detached way, that's often a bad response. Sentimentalism recognizes that sometimes we have to suppress emotions to be effective, like a nurse in a war zone. But it reminds us, those really valuable parts of life, love, passion, real connection, those often come from our feelings.
But the encyclopedia is right to point out, rules and principles are still important for many moral issues. Think about things like torture, keeping promises, lying, stealing. We need impartial rules for those, not just emotional reactions.
The discussion ends looking at charity. Those sentimental attachments, like donating to cancer research because you lost your mom, those are often good reasons for choosing where to give, especially if we acknowledge that meaningful relationships have value beyond just maximizing overall well-being. But this brings up the dilemma. Should our immediate feeling for one person outweigh the potential to help lots of others through more strategic action? Maybe sentiment's best for those long-term bonds, not so much for our fleeting reactions to strangers.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it looks like there's no good philosophical reason to throw out altruism entirely. It exists and matters. The consequentialist ideal, giving everyone's well-being equal weight, that sets a really high bar for altruism. And it might feel tough, but going back to egoism doesn't seem like the better option.
Right? How much and how we express altruism, that probably depends a lot on our individual situations, what we're facing. And it's worth repeating, altruism isn't automatically good in itself. It's morally good if it's aimed right, truly trying to benefit the other person, and based on a decent understanding of what actually makes them better off. Mistaken beliefs about what's good for someone can make even well-intentioned altruistic actions go wrong. True, admirable altruism comes from understanding well-being and being committed to effectively acting for others.
And when we see those who seem to lack concern for others, we might think about the consequences for their own flourishing, like Abimanism suggests, or see it as not being rational, not thinking impartially. But maybe, at its root, it's just not caring when they should.
And on that note, one final thought for you. Think about how our idea of well-being, what we think makes a good, flourishing life, shapes how we feel about and judge altruistic actions. How might those different philosophical views on well-being, whether it's about pleasure, satisfying desires, or some objective list of good things, how might those affect how we prioritize our own needs versus others, and how we judge the altruistic actions of those around us? It's a deep, fundamental question, and one that philosophy keeps grappling with. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.
Until next time, happy pondering.